When the earliest Anglo settlers arrived in Texas, the very first obstacle they encountered was a belt of trees that would later become known as the Big Thicket. The Big Thicket forest region once covered more than 2 million acres in East Texas. The Spaniards, who once ruled the region, defined its boundaries in the north as El Camino Real de los Tejas, a trail that ran from central Texas to Nacogdoches. In the south, the boundary was La Bahia Road, or Atascocito Road, a trail that ran from southwest Louisiana into southeast Texas west of Galveston Bay. To the west, the region was bounded by the Brazos River, and to the east, the Sabine River. This thickly wooded area proved to be a natural barrier against settlement. It had remained largely uninhabited, even by Native Americans, until the 19th century. The old-growth forests of the Big Thicket were an extraordinarily well-developed and predictable ecological region. The thick upper canopy shaded most light before it reached the forest floor. Seasonal wildfires wiped out any undergrowth that managed to find a sliver of good light to grow in. It was said that one could ride a horse at full gallop between the trees of the old-growth forests. In 1836, the eastern timbers, as they were known, were such a dominating and expansive forest that no one could have believed that within 90 years they would be effectively wiped off the landscape, at enormous profit for an elite few. But how did we get there? What allowed these changes to the landscape to occur? And most of all, what was life like for the common man who lived and died for $1.50 a day, and how did he interact with his neighbors? Even as late as 1870, the major forests of East Texas were largely pristine, with some trees growing to more than 150 feet in height and more than 5 feet in diameter. This began to change rapidly in the 1880s as railroad lines were completed across the state. In 1877, Pennsylvania entrepreneurs Henry J. Lutcher and G. Buddell Moore established a major mill in Orange, creating the largest and most modern operation in the state. In the late 1870s, the timber industry entered what was known as the Bonanza era, as lumber plants and logging roads crisscrossed the forests. The advent of the skidder brought the Industrial Revolution to Texas logging industry. Before, any felled timber had to be dragged out of the woods via a horse team and floated downriver to the mill location. Once the skidder came along, horses and mules were replaced by steam-powered winches and railroads. The early mechanical skidders were steam-powered. They operated by using pulleys and cables to drag felled trees to the rail transport cars, where they would be then taken to the mill. Unlike horses, the steam motors never got tired, bogged down in mud, or needed to be fed. With modern industrial equipment, timber barons could operate mills and timber collection virtually non-stop. They soon began harvesting timber at an unprecedented rate. This culminated in 1907 with over 2.3 billion board feet of timber being harvested in East Texas. Plant owners, borrowing from the likes of Carnegie and other great industrialists of the Gilded Age, built company towns to attract employees. These towns include the modern cities of Camden, Kirbyville, and Diboll. Working conditions for timber workers were harsh and dangerous. Work days averaged 11 hours and pay was typically between $1.50 to $2.50 per day. In many cases, the owners established a nearly feudal structure of control, exercising near absolute authority over the towns and their residents. Oftentimes, workers were paid in scrip as opposed to cash. This scrip could be exchanged for goods and services in the mill town. In the mill town, the company owned everything. They owned all the houses, they owned all the shops, they owned the churches, and oftentimes they owned the brothels. This allowed timber barons to minimize expense and maximize profit. Race relations in the mill towns usually were calm, if not outright amicable. Cary Smith, a black man employed by Southern Pine Lumber Company in Diboll for 65 years, related his story of a 1928 Baptist church service in a 1982 interview, saying, "Me and all my folks was Deepwater Baptist, and on Sunday, after the sermon, we'd all go down to the river, blacks and white folks, and one by one we'd all line up to let the preacher totally immerse us in the water. That's the difference between regular and Deepwater Baptists. We have the total immersion. While on Sundays Jim Crow may have taken a back seat, segregation was not totally absent from the mill towns. Blacks and whites lived in segregated housing and had segregated schools, and it was not uncommon for the black and white school sports teams to compete with each other. Both sets of uniforms said Southern Pine Lumber Company, of course. Work crews, however, were integrated, with the exception to the all-white management. When the Great Depression began, the traditional lumber industry in East Texas began to come apart at the seams. The decaying of this system had lasting impacts on vast swaths of the population in East Texas. Prior to the stock market crash, the typical business model for a lumber company was to attract northeastern investors, option or buy timberland, and begin operations. The use of industrial machinery made this system incredibly profitable. So much so that instead of replanting areas where the resource had been depleted, a portion of profits was simply diverted into acquiring new land. By the turn of the 20th century, the dwindling number of large private landholders and the increasing number of timber companies operating in East Texas began to drive property values up. In order to get around this problem, timber companies began exploiting Texas's use and possession laws to take small private landholders' property through litigation. When the Depression began, demand for lumber nosedived, while timber resources were reaching a state of depletion. It was the black workers in mill towns who lost their jobs first, but soon there would be throngs of people, both white and black, who had no job, no property, and nowhere to go. When a whole company went under, it was even worse. Suddenly, a town that had previously had populations of several thousands and several satellite day camps would have a population numbering in the hundreds or lower almost overnight. Most people started moving into the Houston and Dallas metropolitan areas trying to find new opportunities. The 50-year boom that was the timber bonanza had come to a close, with over 18 million acres of forest cleared. Today, Texas consistently ranks in the top 10 nationally in lumber-producing states. Environmental and business regulations enacted in the last 50 years have allowed the forest to become consistently productive, reinvigorating some local economies. However, the vast majority of former bustling little towns throughout East Texas are a shell of their former selves. Even today, as one drives along Highway 59, the vestiges of the great timber boom are apparent all around. An abandoned mill here, early 20th century style buildings there, and most of all, the trees themselves. The original dominant flora of East Texas was the longleaf pine tree, but those have been over 99% eradicated from the state of Texas. Instead, mostly for economic reasons, the prevalent pine tree is now the loblolly.